right. Well, today we have come to the last Sunday of our series in the book of Genesis. So it's a milestone, and the series has been called 12 Stories from the book of Genesis. And I can take this off now. All right. And so these 12 stories, we've been looking at them all, and we've been tracing the contours of God's master plan through the very beginning of his story. And, more recently, we've been looking at the stories of what they call the patriarchs: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the founding fathers of the faith. And what we've seen is in all of these stories is that the point of these stories is to show us that God desires a relationship with human beings, and, very importantly, the terms of the relationship are the terms of a life of faith. And so we've been learning a lot about what it means to have a life of faith through these stories. And Abraham's story, as you would remember, showed us that faith in God means trusting that God is able to do anything that he says he is going to do, and anything that God says he is going to do is good. And so trusting in that God is able and that God is good. Now, the story of Isaac and his second-born son Jacob, which we talked about last week, this showed us the importance of valuing God's choice above all things, and how that is just as fundamental to our faith in God as anything else, because it enables us to look for the things that God is doing and what God will do in our lives, what he chooses to do. Now, we come to the life of Joseph. And Joseph's life will teach us what it means to live in and believe in the reality of God's justice over all of our life. Now, as we're going to find out, a lot of really bad things happened to Joseph. And then a lot of really good things happened to Joseph. And then Joseph was given power over those who had perpetrated most of the really bad things against him. And instead of holding on to the fact that he had been victimized, instead of furthering the evil of others and inflicting evil himself, Joseph chose to see God's goodness at work, even in the most terrible of circumstances. I want us to look for that in our story, and we will say more on these things throughout. But, let us begin. And the first thing we actually need to know about Joseph is Joseph's father, who we've already known, and that's Jacob. But Jacob had 12 sons. So he had a big family, Joseph did. And we remember Jacob, of course. He was the one who fought with God and with men. And so God touched his hip and broke him. And he gave him a new name. You remember what that name was? Israel. That's right. Do you remember what Israel means? Israel means he fights with God. Now, here's the cool thing, though. It can also mean God fights for him. It's a double meaning. It's awesome. And even though Israel started off as one guy's name, what actually happened in history is that all of God's people would come to be known as Israel. And even today, we also are named as such, for we are what God calls in the Bible spiritual Israel, otherwise known as the church. And what a wonderful thing to consider, that the very name of God's people is Israel, which used to be about a dude who fought with God's plan for him, but is now all about the people that God fights for in his plan. So I think that's an awesome thing. And let's get back to the story, though. So Jacob had 12 sons, and Joseph was Jacob's favorite son. Now listen, it's not right to have a favorite child, all right? It is important to understand that everything in the Bible, well, just because the Bible tells us that something was a certain way, that doesn't mean the Bible is telling us that is how it should have been, right? Or how it should be for us. Now, what it tells us is that God worked with flawed people who lived flawed lives. And that's a good thing, because that's what we are too. So anyways, Joseph knew he had the special place in his family, even though he was second youngest, and all of his older brothers were actually grown men, and he was just a teenager, but this is just the type of annoying person Joseph was, that he would always tell his older brothers that even God had chosen him for a special place. He boasted over them and said that God had given him a dream, that one day all of his brothers, and even his mother and father, would come down and bow before him. Now, it just so happened that these dreams were from God, and it also so happens that these dreams would in fact one day come true, as we'll find out, but I'm sure that didn't make it any less annoying, especially for his older brothers, whom I very much doubt even believed those dreams were real at the time. But what really made things much worse, and probably if it wasn't for this last thing, Joseph's brothers would have just ignored all the rest, but really what made things so much worse was that Joseph's father made Joseph supervisor over his older brothers and gave him a special coat of many colors. And then he would send him out to check up on his brothers and report back to him. As you can imagine, Joseph's brothers couldn't stand him. In fact, they hated him. And one day, when Joseph came out to meet them in the fields, they decided to kill him. So they grabbed Joseph and they threw him in a well. And that's where they would have left him, but just then a group of slave traders came by who were headed off to the distant land of Egypt. So they said, hey, instead of killing him, let's make a little money. And let's sell him as a slave to these guys. So that's what they did. And then they took Joseph's special coat and they tore it up. And then they put some blood on it. And then they took it to their father and let him believe that his favorite son had been eaten by wild animals. Jacob was heartbroken when he heard this. Here's what the Bible says. Genesis 37, 31 through 35. And then they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, this we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not. And he identified it and said, it is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, no, I shall go down to Sheol to my son in mourning. Thus his father wept for him. Now, when Joseph arrived in Egypt, he worked in the house of a man named Potiphar. When Potiphar saw that Joseph was a trustworthy servant, he said, Joseph, you are a good worker. Now you are in charge of all my slaves. So that was good. Apparently Joseph was also a handsome young lad, because one day Potiphar's wife took notice of him, and she called out to Joseph, oh, Joseph, my husband is away, so come to my bed and lay down with me. But Joseph knew that that would be a sin. He said to her, how can I do that? For I would betray Potiphar's trust in me, and even worse, I would betray God. And so what did Joseph do? He ran out of the house as fast as he could. Now this made Potiphar's wife very angry. So she called out, help, oh help me, for this slave has tried to hurt me and have his way with me. And so the guards came, and they probably didn't even ask any questions. They just arrested Joseph for a crime he did not commit. So if we're keeping score at home, that's 2 times so far in his rather short life that Joseph has been seriously wronged in a devastating and life-changing way. So not only is he a slave in a foreign land, but now he is also an imprisoned slave, wrongly accused of assaulting his master's wife. But even in jail, God was with Joseph. God had a special purpose for Joseph, which Joseph did not really know about at the time, but God had chosen Joseph, and so God blessed Joseph, even in the midst of really bad things happening to him. This is strange right now. This is strange if we think about it, because I doubt that's how we really look for God's blessing in our life. Am I right? Probably the way we are inclined to look for God's blessing in our life is the very straightforward way of only good things ever happening to us, right? But that's just not the way it works. God's blessing on us does not manifest in nothing bad ever happening, but rather it is how God will take bad things that other people do to us and somehow continue to bless us in and around, and sometimes, just sometimes, through those very things. That's what we find here in Joseph's life. I'm sure becoming an imprisoned slave in the land of Egypt was not how Joseph imagined God would be blessing him. But the jailmaster saw that Joseph was a trustworthy man, and he said, "Joseph, now you will be in charge of all the prisoners." Hooray! I guess. I mean, I suppose that's better that way than any other way if one simply must be a slave, right, in prison. But don't worry, the story is not over yet. God has better things than this in store for Joseph. You see, Joseph had been given by God the ability to understand dreams, a gift he had previously used to great effect in annoying his brothers. But he did start using it a little more graciously while he was in prison. One prisoner was very happy when Joseph told him that a certain dream meant that he would be getting out of jail very soon. Now, he was an innocent man, and Joseph told him that his dream meant that very soon the real criminal would be found out and would be hanged, and he would be let to go free. Now, the real criminal happened to be the other guy over there that Joseph knew in prison, so that was bad for him, but he was guilty. Now, when the innocent man left prison, he thanked Joseph, and Joseph asked him to remember him, because just like that guy who was going free, Joseph was innocent too. You see, I told you the story wasn't over yet, so things must be getting better for Joseph very soon. After all, God is with Joseph even in prison, and God would never let an innocent man stay in prison for very long. Well, as it turns out, his friend actually forgot all about him the minute he left jail. So that was great, right? God uses Joseph in an innocent man's life, who then subsequently finds justice in his life, all the while Joseph is forgotten about in prison. Well, some time passes, but one day Pharaoh had a very troubling dream. He thought that the gods were trying to tell him something, so he asked if anyone could interpret this dream. Well, no one could, except finally, Joseph's friend remembered, hey, there's this guy named Joseph that he interpreted a dream for me when I was in prison, so, I don't know. So he told Pharaoh about Joseph, and Joseph was brought out of jail. Joseph told Pharaoh exactly what the dream meant. And Pharaoh was so impressed. He said, "Joseph, now you will be in charge of all the people in Egypt." Yeah, that does sound a little crazy, am I right? But that's what happened. But, this is great for Joseph, but how does something like that happen? Well, the thing of it is that interpreting dreams was a very highly prized skill in those days. It was a sign that a person like Joseph had a very special connection to the divine world. And in ancient Near Eastern, with these ancient Near Eastern kings, they were always looking for people like Joseph to become counselors and advisors and even to help run the country in the case of very trusted advisors. So finally, things seem to be turning out well for Joseph, and I think we can easily see the hand of God finally showing up in his life. But the story is not yet over. At this time, a famine swept over all the land. Joseph was wise. He was in charge of Egypt, and he saved food for all the kingdom because of Pharaoh's dreams, which had told him that the famine was coming. So because of this, many people would come to Egypt and trade for food, and they would come before Joseph and bow down before him. You see, now the dreams Joseph had as a young man seemed to make more sense, right? Although likely he forgot about those dreams, because one day, much to Joseph's surprise, he saw that his brothers, the very brothers who had sold him into slavery, had come and bowed down before him to beg for food. His brothers did not recognize him. Now, after all, you'd have to imagine Joseph was dressed as a prince of Egypt, which meant he had his head shaved, he had makeup, some eye tattoos. Who knows? He had all of that. So he was an Egyptian guy for all they knew. Now, at first, when Joseph realized that these right here were the people who had mistreated him and victimized him, and they were standing, bowing right before him, he was angry. But then he realized that he had actually missed his brothers, and that he missed his father and his baby brother Benjamin most of all. So he revealed himself to them. And they were so afraid because they were like, this guy's going to seek revenge, right? But Joseph said to them, look, you did evil to me, but the thing you meant for evil, God has used for our good. Let's read that part straight from the text. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father alive? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. So Joseph said to his brothers, come near to me, please. And they came near. And he said, I am your brother, Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and ruler over all of the land of Egypt. And that was Genesis 45, 3-8. And we could see how Joseph is able to see beyond what human beings have done. And instead, he has kept his own heart centered on the plan that God had for him, and really the plan that God had for all of God's people. You see, this is the faith of Joseph. And it is the faith of a person who keeps their eyes on the justice that only God can bring. You know, it's actually put in even better terms, and that is after Jacob dies. So this is some years later, but Joseph buries his father, and you know what? The brothers get fearful again. Now that the father is dead, will Joseph take this opportunity to, in fact, exact revenge? In other words, Joseph had only spared them for the sake of their father. It's a possibility. So now this is what happens. And this is Genesis 50. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, it may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him. So they sent a message to Joseph saying, your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin because they did evil to you. Yeah, right. And now, please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. And so Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, behold, we are your servants. But Joseph said to them, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. It's amazing. It really is. Here's what Joseph learned in his life. In his life, Joseph learned that everything bad that had ever happened to him, and even though we can never say the evil things came directly from God, and so these things were not God's plan for Joseph, well, even though those things were used by God to work out the good plan that God did have for Joseph and the plan God had for all of Joseph's family. So Joseph could say something like, you did not send me here, God sent me here. That's an amazing thing to say. And what this is it's Joseph taking the power back. You see, Joseph was victimized by the evil of others. But by his faith in God, Joseph was given the capability to see something bigger than his own pain. He was able to see that even though his brothers deserved punishment, Joseph was not going to put himself in the place of God to make sure his brothers got the punishment they deserved, even though he easily could have. Instead, he chose to look in a better direction, in the direction of God's master plan for his people. Joseph chose to see God's justice in the wider view of history and let that define him and his faith. You see, that is the story of Joseph's faith. Now, there's one little detail which is not usually included in most tellings of Joseph's journey here, but which really drives home what his whole life is about. And that is at the very end of his life. And it is the one thing that the New Testament even says about Joseph at all. And here it is in the book of Hebrews, Hebrews 11:22. By faith, at the end of his life, by faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the Exodus, which would be over 400 years in the future. And he gave directions concerning his bones. What is that about, right? Let me tell you something. It's actually about the same thing we've been talking about this whole time. You see, this is the type of person Joseph was. He was always thinking about what God had promised, not just to him, but to all of God's people. And he was always looking forward to the day when God's promises would be fulfilled and God's justice would come true for everyone. And not just his own personal justice, but even for his brothers who betrayed him and all of their children whom Joseph swore he would take care of them for all of his life. Joseph believed in a better justice. And this is real faith, to overlook personal pain and to see the bigger things that God is up to in the world. To look with your whole life in a better direction. To look in the direction of God's beautiful and wonderful plan. And to see how one day mercy and justice can meet. And they have met in the person of Jesus Christ and everything God has promised in him. Jesus is the fulfillment of Joseph's faith. He's the fulfillment of all of the faith that has ever been recorded in the Bible and in all the world. A true faith in God, no matter where we are in our story. This is what we can take away from Joseph's example. Just remember, no matter where we are in our story is not over yet. And just remember this, our story is a part of a much bigger, much better story of what God is doing in the world. And so let's look in that direction this morning and every morning. No matter what situation we're in. I doubt any of our situations have ever gotten as bad as Joseph. Could you imagine? That was pretty bad, right? Can we look in a better direction when bad things happen to us? That is faith. And so today, let's look in that direction with all of our hearts, and let's sing our final song today.